Good evening. My name is Jerry McCabe, and I'm a member of the Scottish Laity Network, and it's good to be with you all this evening. Tonight, it is my privilege to welcome you to the third evening of our Lenten Journey 2023, with our overall theme, the common good. The concept of the common good has a long history in the Catholic Church. But what exactly does it mean for us as disciples of Jesus in the world today? This is the focus of our Lenten journey, to reflect on the common good in the context of our discipleship. Throughout our Lenten journey, we seek to align with the central theme of Pope Francis's Lenten Message 2023, Lenten Penance in the Synodal Journey. In this message, Pope Francis, reflecting on our current personal and ecclesial reality, invites us to experience the gospel of the Transfiguration. Francis presents the transfiguration of Jesus' response to the failure of his disciples to understand him. Our Lenten journey is an opportunity to reflect on how well we not only understand Jesus, but how we can authentically follow him in word and deed. It is a unique and special time.
During this liturgical season, the Lord takes us with him to a place apart. While our ordinary commitments compel us to remain in our usual places and our often repetitive and sometimes boring routines, during Lent, we are invited to ascend a high mountain in the company of Jesus and to live a particular experience of spiritual discipline as God's holy people.
So that this transfiguration may become a reality in us this year, Pope Francis proposes two paths to follow in order to ascend the mountain together with Jesus and with him to attain the goal.
The first path, listen to him. Lent is a time of grace to the extent that we listen to him as he speaks to us through Scripture. In addition to the Scriptures, the Lord speaks to us through our brothers and sisters, especially in the faces and the stories of those who are in need. The second path, rise and do not be afraid. Do not take refuge in a religiosity made up of extraordinary events and dramatic experiences, out of fear of facing reality and its daily struggles, its hardships and contradictions.
Pope Francis has also clearly identified one general and basic requirement of our synodal journey, the need to be open and empowered by the Spirit.
Speak honestly. Let no one say, I cannot say this. They will think this or this of me. It is necessary to say with parrhesia, frankness and courage, all that one feels. It is necessary to say all one feels the need to say, without polite deference, without hesitation. And at the same time, one must listen with humility and welcome, with an open heart. Synodality is exercised with these two approaches. For this reason, I ask of you, please, to employ these approaches as brothers and sisters in the Lord, speaking with parrhesia and listening with humility.
As is our tradition, let us now spend a few minutes in prayer, situating ourselves in the gift of our world and our stewardship of it.
O Lord, hear my prayer. O
And I will now hand over to Marion Pallister, who is the chair of Pax Christi Scotland. Marion will say a few words about the Pax Christi and then welcome and introduce our companion for this evening.
Good evening, and it's a privilege to be introducing Tina Beattie, our companion this evening, whose wide-ranging work includes research into environmental theology in the context of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. As the chair of the peace organisation Pax Christi Scotland, I think the Laudato Si document is essential reading for all of us sharing this common home. It's valued by so many people of all faiths and none around the world. And for me, it underscores the inextricable link between the environment and peace. Our sister organisation, Skiath, has a Lenten appeal that focuses on a project in Zambia that's empowering women affected by a series of droughts that had wiped out their crops and their ability to earn from selling produce. Tina, who was raised in Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, may know the area around the mining town of Kabwe, where this project is situated. I know from my own links with Zambia that she'll understand the dire situation facing rural women throughout Zambia and indeed throughout Africa. More than 1.1% of the world's population is displaced right now. Almost 90 million people no longer able to live where they once called home. Many are on the move because their lands can no longer sustain them. They seek livelihoods elsewhere. That stabilizes and damages not only peace of mind, but peace itself. Helping women to stay put, to combat the effects of the climate emergency, can contribute to peace, gender equality, and the common good in every corner of our common home, a situation that Pax Christi Scotland aims to support. We do indeed live in precarious times, even if Scotland is so far only confused by changing weather patterns rather than distressed by them. So I love the fact that Tina describes herself as writer, grandma, wild swimmer, theologian, hanging on in there, but not yet sure where there is. I'm willing to wager that we all identify with not being sure where there is right now. Tina left her post as Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton in August 2020, but she continues in her role as Director of Catherine of Siena College, based at the university. Much of her research focuses on the relationship between the Catholic tradition and contemporary culture, particularly in areas to do with gender, sexuality, and reproductive ethics. Catholic social teaching and women's rights and theology and visual arts are all part of her remit. And she has a keen interest in Marian theology, art and devotion, and in the relationship between medieval mysticism, sacramental theology, and psychoanalytic theory. More recently, she's engaging in research into environmental theology in the context of Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, approaching environmental issues from the perspective of literature, poetry, art, music, gender theory, and sacramentality. Her doctoral research was on the theology and symbolism of the Virgin Mary, and her thesis formed the basis of her book, God's Mother, Eve's Advocate. And these ideas are further developed in New Catholic Feminism, Theology and Theory. Her latest research monograph, Theology After Postmodernity, Divining the Void, was published by Oxford University Press in 2013. She's also the author of The New Atheists, and she has co-edited a number of books and has published articles in journals and edited collections. Tina is a contributor to The Tablet, The Guardian Online, The Conversation, and we can hear her on many radio outlets, broadcasting as she does not only in the UK, but from Canada and Australia. And her latest novel, yes, she writes fiction as well, is called The Good Priest, and it was published by Matador in 2019. Goodness me, what a CV. You're so welcome, Tina. Over to you.
There we are. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, and it's lovely to be back. I wish I was with you in person, really, but good to be here anyway. And that vast CV actually sounds as if I try to be Jill of all trades and mistress of none, but actually the focal point of all that research is questions, to be honest, of what does it mean to be a woman? And it relates back to arriving in this country, having lived in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya all my early life, coming to live in England with my English husband. Probably some of you have heard me tell this story before, but my dad, when I was growing up in Zambia, used to say to me, Tina, if you ever have to choose between a Scotsman and a Zambian, marry the Zambian because they're tribal like us. So of course I married an Englishman. So here I am. But arriving in the UK, having left school at 15, because my mother had the philosophy that you wasted an education on girls, and it was better if I learned to type so that if he ever left me, I could support myself and my kids. So I took her advice. I arrived in Britain in 1988 with 4 very young children, couldn't settle, felt quite unhappy, and decided to scratch the intellectual itch and to go to university the year our youngest child started school. My arrival coincided with Professor Ursula King. I had been a convert to Catholicism for about 4 years by that time, having been brought up as a Presbyterian. So I went to university with lots of naive ideas as the first person in my extended family to go, having very little idea even what a university degree was, and managed to get into feminism almost by default. It was just realizing that here were women scholars asking questions that I had kind of asked myself, but thought I was maybe the only woman in the world to be asking them, because in Zimbabwe Presbyterian Church, we were not a hotbed of radical feminism. And I didn't feel terribly satisfied with the answers of liberal feminist theologians such as Rosemary Ruther and others, but I did think their questions were important. And that's how I began meandering down the road of Lacanian psychoanalysis and medieval art and patristic theology and Marian theology and devotion. It was all and continues to be a quest to say, what does it mean to be a woman in the world? And I was asked tonight to talk on woman and the common good, and I said, no, I'll talk on gender and the common good, because, as I hope to suggest, wherever we look, there is no such thing as a woman. It's situation vacant. And I ask myself if I even want to occupy that kind of signifier, to use a Lacanian term, or if it's best just to leave it vacant and let it drift as it does. This question has always arisen for me in the context of the gender fluid language of the Catholic tradition and its contradictions and tensions. And of course, now it arises in a slightly different way, but not always as radically different as one might expect, through the rise of transgender movements, transgendered identities, and the enormous challenges and questions that poses to us. And, you know, I do sometimes ask myself, as someone who's a fan of René Girard, are we allowing endless preoccupations of sex and gender to distract us from the real issues of our time, the violence, the war, the poverty, the social division. And for you sitting in Scotland, whose First Minister suddenly decided to go off on one about gender, I suspect that might be a particularly relevant question. I am not taking any clear positions on this tonight because I really don't know what to make of these debates yet. So I'm just sharing what I've learned as I've gone along and the questions I'm left with. But also, I don't know if any of you listen to Women's Hour, but why does it matter? Because on Women's Hour this morning, there was a very moving account of the plight of women earthquake victims in Turkey who are going back to abusive partners with their children because it's better to live with an abuser than in a tent. And there was the story of one woman who went back and he poured boiling water over her. She's in intensive care. And he said, "You should be thankful I'm not actually killing you." This is the reality women face in one form or another. In extreme form, if we look at Iraq, at Iran, Afghanistan, women victims in Ukraine, we know that rape is always a weapon of war. We know that when children are killed, mothers lose their lives, literally or metaphorically. I don't want to go on and on, but my focus remains women. Women as female bodies that suffer in the world. And we only need to look at Sarah Everard, at the shooting at Epsom School recently, at the daily head count of women abused and murdered in every society, to see that it is a question of the common good and social justice to focus on that. And it should not be a question of, but if you're focusing on that, you're not focusing on everybody. We have to pick our struggles. And my struggle is female bodies and what it means in the world. But of course, that poses a lot of questions beyond what I can easily answer. So let me bring up my PowerPoint presentation. Can I share my screen? I think I can if I just go in. Oh, wretched Zoom. We ought to all be so good at it now. Part of the problem is my mouse doesn't want to talk to it. There we are. Right, share screen. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes, well done.
Oh, we're getting there. Now, I love Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, painted, well, it was first written about in 1517. So it was painted sometime before then. And, you know, in the Middle Ages, they had a lot more fun around these issues than we do, but they certainly were not blind to them. So Hieronymus Bosch was actually a very upright Catholic burgher of his town. And this lascivious, exuberant painting, of which this is just a detail, was probably painted as a kind of moral allegory about why one should behave oneself and not do all the things he seems to have very vividly imagined doing in the process of painting the painting. I'm not sure Jesus would actually approve if he's a "don't look at another woman with lust in your eyes or you've already committed adultery." I'm not sure what the virtuous Hieronymus Bosch was quite up to, but his paintings are great fun. So, gender and the common good. I've set the scene. I also want to say there's nothing new about these debates, as I hope to show you with a couple of my slides. And I also want to just remind you that, and I would say there still is, a distinction that gets debated and blurred between sex and gender. If we look at the Catholic tradition, it makes no sense unless we can be more gender fluid than Judith Butler. And I'm going to show you why. The question is, how do our sexual bodies get mapped with gender constructs? And how far do we find our own lives positioned with those in ways that may be repressing or violating aspects of ourselves that don't conform to gendered norms? So, Catholic teaching on gender and sex has abandoned its old hierarchical model and gone down the road of complementarity. Now, I could talk for hours on this, and I'm going to try and keep it fairly brief. But personally, I begin to think that maybe it was easier for women to navigate the hierarchical model, which was until the mid-20th century, that male and female are basically just the inferior and superior version of the same kind of body. So the wind happened to be blowing the wrong way, the conditions weren't quite right, and the woman never quite made it to becoming a man when she was conceived. The female never made it to becoming a male. That's one medieval biological theory about all this. But it did mean that there was no essential difference between the sexes. Now, what happened in the mid-20th century when the popes started to realize that feminism was posing a challenge, that they came up with the very new idea of complementarity. There is nothing traditional about theology of the body. I learned the other day from some Catholic heads of schools that in Catholic schools in England, they have to teach theology of the body. I find that very problematic in its present form. But theology of the body is an essentialist theology of sexual difference. Men and different are equal but different, and we're different through and through. Despite this radical difference, popes have no trouble saying exactly what women are, and why there are certain things such as priesthood that women can't do, but we're going to look a little more closely at that. But this is the theology of complementarity. I just need to shrink my screen so as I can, there we are. So in Laudato Si, Pope Francis says, learning to accept our body, to care for it and to respect its fullest meaning is an essential element of any genuine human ecology. Also, valuing one's own body in its femininity or masculinity is necessary if I'm going to be able to recognize myself in an encounter with someone who is different. Pause there. Are femininity and masculinity really the markers of human difference? I am different from every single human being I meet. I'm different from my daughter. I'm different from my husband. I'm different from my sons and my grandchildren. It's whoops, etc., etc. Why has that gone? How my mouse has a life of its own. So why focus not even on sexual difference, but femininity and masculinity, which are certainly cultural characteristics that vary over time and over cultures. So in this way, we can joyfully accept the specific gifts of another man or woman, the work of God, the Creator, and find mutual enrichment. It is not a healthy attitude which would seek to cancel out sexual difference because it no longer knows how to confront it. So that is complementarity and sexual difference in its current papal model. And when we do gender theory, I suppose on the surface, the other end of the spectrum is Judith Butler's gender theory, which has been very influential, in which the theory is that our genders are performative, that we absorb into ourselves the sort of ways in which culture expects us to behave as men or women, and we perform those roles, but we can also perform them differently. We can resist the sort of performances that let us find acceptance in the status quo, and we can adopt different persona. We can make gender a playful, fluid, creative, changing thing. Now, that is one aspect of Butler, and probably associated more with her earlier writings. But in recent years, she also insists that sex as well as gender is fluid and can be changed and changed back again. And that, for me, is where I begin to think quite what are the implications of this. Because this begins to set in place now something that begins to look a little essentialist as well. To say that anybody can perform any gender is different from saying there are ways in which a person can be born in the wrong sexed body and need to change it in order to conform to the gender they are. I'm not going to go into all those questions, but I'm raising them and we can talk about them later. But that's Judith Butler, Gender is Performative. Now, some of the questions that I think challenge us with the present debates, and I'm not going to say there's right or wrong and we should agree or disagree with any of these. They're just questions that we might ask ourselves as we think of where we stand on these issues and how far we're able to move if we hear different arguments and different, more persuasive positions than the ones we currently tenuously hold on to. So if I throw out some of these very common claims today, which do you agree with? Which leave you unsure? Men and women are equal but different. A trans woman is a woman. Women should be ordained to the sacramental priesthood. Patriarchy oppresses women and girls. The church is a woman. Some lesbians have penises. Some people are born in the wrong bodies. There are only two genders. There are more than two sexes. Now, all those are common claims today. And when we think about these issues, I think these are some of the issues that may be swirling around our minds, seeking for answers that we don't have. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that actually the Vatican is often, bizarrely, more clued up on questions of gender theory than mainstream society in this country certainly has been. This is in the year 2000, when the Pontifical Council for the Family is already on to the fact that gender theory is not now about feminism and it's not about sexual difference. It's homophobic. It's seeking to reinforce gender roles as they are, but it is recognizing that gender is claimed to be the product of an interaction between the community and the individual, but that this generic identity is independent from personal sexual identity. Masculine and feminine genders in society are the exclusive product of social factors with no relation to any truth about the sexual dimension of the person. In this way, any sexual attitude can be justified, including homosexuality. And it is society that ought to change in order to include other genders, together with male and female, in its way of shaping social life. Now, I've spent many years criticizing this kind of position from the Vatican. And I still would in many ways. I've been going back through the things I've written on these things, given some of the reservations I may now have around some issues of transactivism, not trans persons, but the activism. And I do think there is something here which in a way is true, that the sort of fluidity of sex and gender has now moved to a point where it is very much becoming about personal choice, individual identity, in ways that go far from the kinds of debates we may have been having around same-sex rights, same-sex marriage, all of which I supported and do support absolutely. But I now have questions. I think we all have questions that are emerging with this changing perspective. But the other question that we have to face when we look at things like this is that it's almost as if a new confusion is being added, because yes, it used to be that this would have been true, that gender is not sex, but now with claims that sexual identities as well as gendered identities are fluid, and the sexual body doesn't have the kind of signifying power that would provide some kind of marker for certain purposes. But then again, if we don't say that, we can't justify why some people would surgically change their sex or hormonally change their sex to be the other sex. So there is huge confusion, and maybe the confusion is just the nature of where we're at in these troubled questions. But when I teach these issues, I teach to a very broad constituency of students, from trans and non-binary people through to very conservative, often some of the African Pentecostal students I've taught from the house churches in and around London would have very serious problems with some of the trans theories and gender theories I teach. So and some conservative Catholics would. So one of the things I do is to take them through Mulieris Dignitatum, and we count the genders. Now I'm up to 5, but I think there are more. So there are no grounds in Catholic teaching to be too absolutist about this, because the teaching of the Catholic Church does not make sense unless we can embrace quite a high level of gender fluidity. And I've given you the 5 genders there. All humans are woman, virgin, bride, and mother. All humans can be, a female human is woman, virgin, bride, and mother. A male human is man, bridegroom, and father. The church is female and male bodies as woman, virgin, bride, and mother. It's an inclusive, feminized maternal gender. The bridegroom in this document is also female and male bodies who love as Christ loves. But then the bridegroom as priest is a sexed male body. So there's considerable confusion, gender fluidity, and one form of sexual essentialism in this document. Only men can be priests. Pope Francis has said more or less the same words as this quotation, which was on a plane coming back from one of his trips when a journalist asked him why women can't be priests. But you'll find the same quote in several different places. Regarding the question of women priests, that is not possible. St. John Paul said so clearly after much study, not because women do not have the ability. In the church, women are more important than men because the church is a woman. It is la Chiesa, not il Chiesa. God. And the Madonna is more important than popes, bishops, and priests. But I must admit, we are somewhat late in an elaboration of the theology of women. We have to move ahead with that theology. Now, for me, as a Catholic, a feminist, someone who will go a very long way embracing gender fluidity and gender theory, I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I read something like this. It's the kind of way I speak to my 4-year-old granddaughter when I want to get her to do something she doesn't want to do. It's patronizing. It actually erases the female body altogether from the scene of representation, because if the church is a woman, then woman is everybody, young, old, male, female, binary, non-binary, trans, everybody is the church as woman. Pope John Paul II, as we know, was Polish, and in Polish, the word kościoł for church is actually masculine. So we have a slight problem with the gendering of language there that Pope Francis doesn't quite seem to realize. But the Madonna is more important than popes, bishops, and priests. All you need to represent the woman in the Mass is a statue of the Madonna somewhere on a pedestal. I could go on about this, but I'm not going to, because I think we get the point. But also, finally, this we. Who needs to elaborate a theology of women? Women have been doing theology for as long as the church has been in existence. Patristic theologians like Gregory and Basil depended on their women. Macrina, Gregory's sister. There are women shaping our theological heritage from the beginning. And certainly in the last 50 years, there are libraries full of theology written by women. So who is this we who is late in developing a theology of women? It's men. Men are going to have to catch up and get a theology of women so that the church as woman can be better understood. So I want to begin by saying, as Cat, well, I'm not beginning, I'm coming to sort of a little bit of elaboration, but I want to just make clear that the church will offer us no helpful solution to navigate the way through some of the controversies we now face about sexual and gendered identities. It's part of the problem, not part of the solution. So moving on, I want to draw your attention to an article that I haven't had time to read carefully yet in the latest version of the journal, Heathrop Journal, by Nicolette Burbach, who's a trans woman, and she works for the Jesuits in London, and she's written an article about the representation of trans people by Helen Watts of the I've just forgotten the name of the institution, but the Biomedical Bioethics Institution, the Catholic Bioethics Institution. It used to be the Anscombe Centre. I don't know if it still is, but this is a critique of the way Helen Watts writes about trans people. And I would recommend reading it. It's quite heavy going. I did try to read it, but I need to spend more time before I engage with it. So, and also I'm very aware, I don't know who's in the audience here, but I'm very aware that I am speaking here. There are no men speaking and there are no trans people speaking, and I'm very wary of speaking about people in absence. So when I talk about some of my own questions that now arise with regard to the conflicts we face, I want to be very mindful of the fact that I'm not in a dialogue and I'm being careful of what I say. I'm posing questions from my own perspective, and there are responses that need to be made. And there might be some people here who will make those responses in the question time. So let's have the full frontal altarpiece by Hieronymus Bosch while we go into the next bit. So I just really want to round up because I think the questions are more important than what I have to say here. There are situations when rights conflict. I don't know if any of you heard, well, I think some people did hear my thought for the day this morning about the dilemma that arose for me and several others when the Home Office proposed turning our local Pontons holiday camp here in the tiny seaside resort of Camber into a refugee holding centre. And on the one hand, I absolutely believe that communities should welcome refugees. On the other hand, I fully understood why 3,000 refugees in a little town of 800 permanent residents was not going to work. And sometimes there are conflicting rights. We can't always tidy it all up. Now, I think when I want to talk about the challenges facing gender today, there are a couple of points I want to make. First of all, I think when church teaching is not being radically gender fluid in the way I've just shown, it's offering us very constrictive stereotypes, not of masculinity. There's very little said about masculinity in church teaching documents. It's nearly all about what women should be: maternal, feminine, feminine genius. It's projection, it's fantasy, it's othering. It is men who want to know what women are so that they know who they are, but they're not listening to women. That's not to say that many women are not very fulfilled by roles that we might call maternal feminine, but many women are not. Many people are deeply fulfilled in traditional models of marriage and family life. Many others are not. I read a survey yesterday which said that on quite a lot of recent research done, it seems that children growing up in non-conventional households, in same-sex marriages raised by same-sex or non-binary couples, seem to fare as well as, and sometimes better than, children growing up in conventional heterosexual households. So there needs to be far greater listening and acceptance of the immense variety of what it means to be a sexed or gendered human being. And for me personally, I would say that has to include letting gender be playful. If a little boy wants to wear dresses, what's the problem? You know, I actually think that the church, by being so reactionary, risks feeding a sense of, gosh, you know, if a woman is all those things, maybe I'm not a real woman, maybe I'm really a man, and vice versa. We need to be able to negotiate these complex areas of human identity. But at the same time, I think there are two issues that arise for me on the other side. One would be a sort of identity politics rooted in extreme individualism, where what we see is the fragmentation of any common good or community around each and every individual's claim to be utterly autonomous and self-defining. And from a Catholic theological point of view, I think that the body and our identities are gifts. They're complex, they're multifaceted, but the language of ownership, the language of individualism, I don't think sits comfortably in our tradition. And I also think, and this is where I get a little controversial, that if we are going to talk about gender and we're going to include questions of transgender, non-binary, we need to actually talk about sexual difference, because I'm not sure it's right to conflate, for example, trans people. I think trans women and trans men are sexually different and culturally different. We're coming at these identities from different backgrounds, different anatomical beginnings, different cultural conditioning. So on the one hand, what we are seeing is, I think, quite a number of adult men becoming trans women, and adults have to be respected in the decisions they make. I'm not part of that community, and it's not my role to judge. I'm a born anatomical female. But we also see, to me, a different and worrying phenomenon, a huge surge in the number of young adolescent girls suddenly identifying as trans, and without having shown any signs before. Now, that does worry me because we do live in a body, in a culture that denigrates the female body, that makes girls feel from day one that they are not good enough. Either we're not Photoshop beauties, like all our friends on social media, or we're dirty, dangerous female sexual bodies that need to be kept under control so that men feel safe. One way or the other, when a girl gets to 12, 13, 14, her body starts to bleed, her breasts start to grow, and men start to look at her in a way that, if she's lucky, she won't have been looked at before. It's not a good experience for many of us. For many of us, our first encounters with sexual difference are violent or abusive. Many women encounter a penis as a weapon long before they encounter it as an expression of love. And that's why I think in navigating rights, we need to ask questions about the self-respect and dignity of female bodies, and to teach girls from a very young age that no matter how you look, what you weigh, what you look like, none of that matters. You have a beautiful body that's a gift from God, and to be female is to be good, dignified and beautiful. And a church that says, sure it is, but it can't represent Christ on the altar. What message does that actually send out? So if we're going to deal with questions of young girls wanting to change sex, I think we're dealing with something different from, say, adult men who are trans women. Now, I think the questions that for me that arise there would simply be, and this arose very much in Scotland with the recent ID case and then the unfortunate case of Isla Bryson a week later, but trans women are varied and different as we all are, but we do know statistically that men, anatomical males, have a much, much higher tendency to sexual violence than women, and that women are much more likely to be victims of sexual violence than men. Men are more likely to be victims of other forms of violence, but women are, and girls are much more likely to be victims of sexual violence. Now, in those circumstances, I don't think it's wrong for women to say, bodies with penises should not be allowed into places where we are sexually vulnerable and intimate. women's changing rooms, hospital spaces, spaces where people are vulnerable and dependent, intimate bodily care. There are various places. This to me is not denying anyone's rights. It's how we navigate respect for each other. There are also concerns about statistics, about particular medical and statistical information we need about how sexual bodies behave differently according to whether they're male or female. And if those get erased under the name of gender identity, crime statistics as well. Again, we saw that with Isla Bryson being put in a women's prison, and when sexual crimes are recorded as woman on woman, but they may not be, I think we have to say that is an issue. So the other concern I have is about the impact of certain medical and hormonal interventions on young developing adolescents. A growing number of countries are raising concerns about the unknown long-term effects of puberty blockers, and there are certainly very high signs that when a young person starts puberty blockers, the vast majority will go on to have more radical hormonal and surgical changes to their bodies. Now, all of this is hugely contested, conflicted, and with vulnerable bodies on all sides, vulnerable people on all sides. But I think we have to be able to ask these questions. We have to be able to discuss them. And as a woman, I want to be able to say what my fears and reservations are without being labelled or abused or dismissed, particularly as an older woman, because we're often told that these are just tired old feminists banging on, young women don't have these problems. I've raised these problems in talks I've given, and I guarantee that young women will come up to me on every occasion and say, thank you for saying what we can't say because we're afraid. So what looks like support can often be frightened silence. And I don't think any ethical position and any promotion of the common good can come about through people who are afraid to speak out. So that's all I want to say. And I'm sorry if it rambles a bit, but I don't think there is much great clarity on this. We just need to raise the issues. And now I'll stop and ask for you to chip in with your comments, questions, observations, whatever.
Wow, you've given us so much to think about, honestly, Tina.
Oh, sorry, I've given you James Bond now. I'm not going to use that. I need to get out of the screen saving. Whoops.
Just give you a minute to
yeah, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Can I just ask again, you know, we've already got some questions in the chat function, but
sure. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes, you have. Yes.
I was doing a talk the other day, an in-person talk, and I went to put my PowerPoint up, and it was still open on a page of my latest novel I'd been working on, where it just happened to have very purple language at the top of the page. And in front of an audience, I had to quickly shut that down and find my PowerPoint. So there we go. Questions.
I think you would have got a lot of street cred for that, actually, Tina. Yes, I was just going to say, you know, we usually invite people to add questions into the chat function. I've already got quite a few coming through. So what I'm going to try and do is be your voice. If you put your question into the chat, I'll try and paraphrase it and feed that into Tina to talk about. So much going on. I mean, I've just learned so much listening to you personally tonight, and I've got all sorts of ideas of things I want to read up afterwards. I'm sure lots of people have too. I'm going to start with my question, actually, and it just struck me when you were talking about the church being a woman, and I just wondered, I just feel that there's so little awareness of women in the church and the roles of women in the church. and perhaps the idea of the church being a woman is just a sort of apology for actually, not valuing women in any real concrete terms. Well, the church is a woman, so that's enough, kind of thing. I just wondered how you'd respond to that, really.
Yes, I agree. I mean, personally, and this is where some feminists disagree with me, but the idea of the church as mother is ancient, and I think it's very important. But, if you look at images of Mary from the early Middle Ages, the Romanesque sort of era, the mother is not feminine. The mother is matriarchal. She's way beyond the max factor virgin who doesn't even have a baby in her arms. I mean, she's a hugely potent figure. And Sarah Jane Boss has written a wonderful book many years ago now, but it's still called Empress and Handmaid, which shows how changing attitudes to nature are reflected in changing representations of the Virgin through history. And so if Pope Francis really wants us to get to grips with the climate crisis, and this is why my foray into environmental theology is still about gender, he's written a whole encyclical on Mother Earth that doesn't mention women.
Wow.
How is that possible? Women are in the forefront of grassroots effective climate change activism, and women are likely to be the most immediately affected by climate change. So both in terms of listening to the poor and in terms of encouraging effective action, where are the women? Gender is one of the top issues in the Sustainable Development Goals. How can the Vatican be so unaware? It's not unaware. What's it hiding? What's it afraid of? I don't know. But yes, I agree. We're being given this great big baggy church as an excuse for not allowing the female body to have any sacramental significance.
John Woodhouse is asking, I'm sort of linked to that, about women who work in the Vatican, that 1 in 4 who work in the Vatican are women, but very few are in senior roles. John wonders how this can be changed, and I'm just wondering if that impacts on your previous answer, really, the fact that there are few women that are actually, in leadership roles.
There are very few, and they are watched. And I know that's true. I mean, in the forthcoming synod, Sister Natalie Becard has a vote. We have 1 woman and 1 vote so far. So I must just add with that, though, that some of you may have seen that last year Catholic Women Speak did a survey in conjunction with the University of Newcastle in Australia that we had translated into 8 languages and circulated around the world on what it means to be a woman in the Catholic Church today. We had over 17,000 answers from all over the world. Catholic women are diverse. There are no single issues that emerge, but there are shared concerns which we share across the board. And yesterday on International Women's Day, one of the authors of the report, Tracy McEwen, was in Rome enjoying the hospitality of the Australian ambassador to the Holy See. And there are some lovely photos I've put on Facebook of Tracy with Pope Francis surrounded by women, and she presented the full analysis of our report. We did a short report for the Synod last October, but the full analysis is now available online. So I don't know. Sister Natalie Becard was very supportive of that.
Would you be able to send a link for that at all, Tina, so that people can look that up? That would be really helpful, actually. I'm going back to John. He's just put in another question, and this again is about women, role of women in the church. He's worked very happily with Church of England priests. How do we get Roman Catholic male clergy and seminarians to realise the gifts that these women have? And he says that our English bishops are meeting Church of England bishops, including women. So why are their minds not being changed? I mean, women seem to be working very effectively in other churches, not just Church of England, but Episcopalian Church here in Scotland, many of the Baptist churches, free churches. What's the problem?
Yeah, we do have a problem. To be fair, though, I think one of the problems is that we are an incarnational church. We take the body very, very, very seriously. I speak as a former Presbyterian. Certainly, bodies were not deeply mapped with Presbyterian doctrine when I was growing up, other than that women should know their place, which wasn't in the pulpit then either. But we do have a problem in the Catholic Church, and I think part of it is because we have the Marian tradition, we have a sacramental priesthood, we have a viscerally sacramental faith. And we know that bodies can be pretty untamable. I mean, bodies are not safe. You know, we don't all just, I don't know, there's something about liberalism which does not acknowledge the potency of what it means to be human, for good and for ill. And I think the Catholic Church does. But what we have is a lot of celibate men running terrified of sex and actually ending up, half of them, because they're so afraid, you know, becoming either colluding or abusing. So yeah, we do have a problem. And I don't want to underestimate it. I was asked to give a talk to a group of mainly priests and deacons recently, and I was asked to talk on women in the church, and then I got a message saying some of our priests are a bit nervous about what you're going to say. Well, quite frankly, that's another reason I didn't want to talk about women in the church tonight. I'm so fed up with it. I refuse to do the talk. I'm not going to do that anymore. But when we have that mindset, and you know, other priests were wonderful and said, please come, we're so sorry this has happened, but no, guys, get your house in order and then I'll come and talk to you. It's not my job to sort that out. And I think every woman in the church has the same story, every single woman. I just heard another shocking story the other day about a women's school being told they don't need representation in a coalition of schools here because the Jesuits will represent them.
Ooh.
The Jesuit school has more money and more influence. So the religious order run by women religious, or you know, associated with women religious, doesn't need to be represented because the Jesuits are there. So
I've got a question now. This is really going into your the sort of gender complexity idea. Paul asks, it's a pity that the church cannot accept the complexity you've outlined. How is it to be got out of the rut of old-fashioned certainty?
I love to think that the Holy Spirit is kind of saying, yes, that's a good question. You know, we need to work with what we've got. We have wonderful theological resources around gender. And I think we have better theological resources around gender in the Catholic Church than there are most other places. You know, as I say, we certainly out-gender Judith Butler when we get going. So we need to use that prayerfully, creatively, constructively, aware of all the vulnerabilities and aware that, sadly, vulnerable people don't all stand in the same place of vulnerability. Everybody's vulnerable in different ways. All of us are. Even, well, maybe especially Vladimir Putin is vulnerable. You know, everybody is vulnerable. The question is, you can't let one vulnerable person trample on another vulnerable person's rights to make them feel okay.
I think actually that's kind of behind Anne Burnett's question, because she says it's difficult and somewhat fearful to discuss giving the vitriol around. I've never known an issue that's created such a reaction. And she says, I value a respectful dialogue. What are people fearful of? Maybe it's you know, when people are fearful, they're expressing their inadequacy in some way. I don't know. What do you think about that, Tina?
You know, I am aware of this dialogue being very it's easy to cause hurt and it's easy to get angry, and I do both, and I feel hurt, and you know, it's because it's really important to us, all of us, you know, questions of gender and who we are, and why is it so volatile? You know, Yeah, because it matters. And talking of the common good, it isn't an individualistic thing. You know, it affects us in all our relationships, gender, sexuality, the way these create the dynamics between us as human beings. And our fear of either being, well, we live in a culture where victimhood is a competition. And the louder a person speaks about what a victim they are, the less likely they are to be really a victim. As the sex abused people know in our own church, there is a terrible silence for years when you're a victim. To be honest, speaking as a woman, it took me until my mid-40s to take my clothes off in an all-female changing room. As children, we would wrap towels around ourselves and get dressed into our swimsuits under our towels. That's my generation. Now, as that's no sooner happened than I'm being told, yeah, but you know, you can't just have this space for biological females because, you know, what about trans women? Well, as I say, for me, it's a question of penises have no place in those spaces. Now, that's too invasive because I'm not going to look in people's knickers to see who they are. We need to just respect that there are certain fundamental areas. I would love to live in a utopia where we could all get naked together all the time. That's not the world we live in. To get towards that world, we mustn't begin by telling women that their safety and their privacy is sacrificed to something else. We must begin by saying to men, why are women and trans women so afraid to be with you? What's the problem? So don't evacuate spaces because men are too violent. Challenge those spaces. What, you know, why do men who feel vulnerable, trans women, you know, why do they need to escape the violence of men? And, you know, they do. I mean, I know, I've seen it firsthand. When a neighbour came out as trans during lockdown, I couldn't believe what happened, what was said. And, you know, that's not acceptable ever. And I can understand why people don't want to live with that violence day in and day out. But women live with it day in and day out all our lives. And, you know, as we saw in that unfortunate experiment in Scotland, if you give men access to women's spaces in the name of inclusivity, you put women at risk. Not from trans women. I'm not at all saying that. But by providing opportunities to very cunning men.
I've got a couple of questions here, which are very interesting. One of them is going back to the idea of Christ and the bride. I'm just going to read this one out to you, Tina, and just see what you make of it. This is from Mary McHugh, and she says, if men only can be priests because only males can represent Christ and the bridegroom, then it logically follows that if the church is female, only women can represent the church, the bride. So only women should be able to receive communion. And only women represent the church in general, or maybe men and women can do both. I don't know what you make of that.
Absolutely. Yes.
There's a bit of logic in there, really, isn't there?
There is. Well, if only men can be priests, why?
Yeah.
Because the priest is the bridegroom who is Christ. What qualifies him to be the bridegroom? I'm sorry, people are going to think I'm obsessed with male anatomy, but, you know, it's meat and two veg. That's all it is. And what also deeply troubles me about that, because this language is new. I mean, nuptial theology has been there again all the way back. The language of eroticism is there. But the idea that this is now tethered to the anatomical male body as bridegroom. And if you read, and I'm about to have an essay published actually on theology and the sex abuse crisis, which looks at how this language is used in a very sexual way. If you say to a vulnerable, sexually repressed, confused young priest, you are a priest because you are the sexual bridegroom, and he looks out, there are children, there are women, there are men, here comes everybody. And what does it do to the sexuality of a priest to say, you know, when you're up there, you don't just represent Christ on the altar in a sort of metaphorical nuptial way. It's to do with your anatomical makeup that you're qualified to be there. It's dangerous.
Well, I feel deeply personally uncomfortable with that, I must say, you know. Yeah.
So yes, Mary, this problem would be solved by ordaining women. Then we can play with the gender symbolics. We can enjoy our tradition of gender fluidity and erotic language and all that, but we provide a kind of checks and balances on each other. I do think male and female, it's not to say a woman priest only represents the maternal feminine and male priest only represents the masculine. I mean, that's all silly, you know, bodies on the altar. So when, you know, I've supervised an Anglican woman priest on this who had to use the Catholic Eucharistic prayer to get a feminist reading of priesthood. When a woman says, this is my body, this is my blood, we don't immediately think of death, torture and crucifixion. We think of childbirth and fertility.
Yeah.
That's what the female body signifies with body and blood. That's good. And, you know, medieval art showed Christ on the cross as giving birth through his side. The wound in his side is vaginal. He's dying and he's giving birth to the church. So we have an amazing resource in all that. Let's use it.
That's beautiful. Gareth Morgan he's talking about Mary. He says that Catholic theology draws on Mary's yes at the Annunciation. I think this is a very interesting question, actually. And he says, does Tina see this as entirely consensual? Gabriel's language, you know, blessed are you among women, could be seen as grooming. And tradition suggests she was just below the modern age of consent. But then if her pregnancy was not consensual, doesn't this destroy many foundational elements of our faith, especially the theology of the body?
Well, you know, if I start on theology of the body, you'll be here all night. So I'm not gonna go there, but I believe it absolutely was consensual. And again, I get that from tradition. She used to be known in the early church as the rational paradise because her body was the new earth from which the new Adam was taken. Her womb was like the Garden of Eden, but she was a rational person. And another thing the early church does is the figure of Eve is often a kind of what if. It's not that Eve was this monstrous woman. It was, what if Mary had said no? Then kind of Eve becomes the person, the idea we play with. But Eve was always redeemed in Mary. Mary's the new Eve. So yes, it's consensual. And that's why, as a convert, I really think the place of Mary is very, very important. St. Augustine says, there's a beautiful passage in Augustine that's taken up elsewhere, that, you know, Mary, what are you waiting for? The angel is at your gate. All of creation is holding its breath. Give your yes. Why are you keeping the angel waiting? The other point is, angels are androgynous. Angels are not muscular young men. So this is an act of impregnation that does not involve male intervention, angelic or physical. And, you know, if it hadn't been, then in the end, it would have been Joseph's yes. There wouldn't have been much Mary could do about it if Joseph was not in the mood. Joseph didn't have to be in the mood. God was in the mood.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, I think of Mary, and I agree with you. I think it is consensual. And I think of Mary saying, how can this be? And she questioned. And I think that's the essence of what we do when we're authentic Christians. We question. We don't just accept, we question, and we work through, and we ask God to help us understand. So for me, that's also a sign that Mary was, you know, Mary was a good pattern to follow, kind of thing for us.
And she was betrothed. The fact that she was going to have a baby shouldn't have surprised her, but she knew that she was in waiting for something that wasn't clear. And was this it? And of course, the other wonderful thing is when Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, questions the angel. He's struck dumb, and his wife gets to name the baby.
Yes.
The fundamental patriarchal act of naming is given to the woman.
Mm.
Mary asks the question and she gets a response, and she's told to name the child. You know, it's hidden in full sight, the redemptive significance of women in the gospel stories.
Beautiful. I'm going to add a question from Gemma. Now Gemma is one of our core group for the SLN, and very, very clever lady. And she says men in general don't read women authors. Getting our priests and bishops and popes to read women authors might be a start. How do we get the church to join the dots between the way they speak about and speak to women, and also the idea of domestic violence and sexual abuse, etc.? How do we get them to join the dots with that?
No, men. Well, Pope Francis values Maria Mazzucato and Kate Raworth as women economists, and Mariana Mazzucato has now been appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life. So he does listen to women economists and reads them. But it amuses me because, of course, the oikos is the household. And I ask myself, does he think it's fine to have women as the cosmic housekeepers, but not as theologians, philosophers, and equals? So why don't they read women? You know, I was with one of his close advisors who was very much involved in writing Laudato Si, who's now quite a senior cardinal. And I said to this man, where are the women in Laudato Si? And his answer was something like, well, we can't do everything. My point is, you can't keep women on the shelf. You know, Laudato Si doesn't work because it doesn't understand gender. You can't talk about Mother Earth as this poor wounded victim in the ditch, waiting for a new breed of man to come and rescue her, because Mother Earth is like women mothers. We fight back. We don't passively wait to be rescued. We make harsh decisions about our offspring. Mother Earth is going to do that to us. And this whole image in Laudato Si of this wounded, feminine, helpless mother, it's wrong. It's really wrong. Just as the image of women as you know, women who must be told what to do with their bodies, their reproductive capacities. I mean, in our survey of 17,000 plus Catholic women, there were a significant minority were very conservative, but a significant majority think that the church needs to do more to respect women's sexual and reproductive decisions and rights.
I don't think you'd get many people opposing that, actually. I don't think. I'm going to just take one last question, if that's all right. This is going back to Paul, and he says, if we take all this language literally, then applied to the Mass, he says there should be a quorum of 13 with one in a state of mortal sin, and as in the Last Supper. So just wondered if you'd like to just comment on that.
Well, thank God we do seem to have slightly shelved the idea of mortal sin, although, you know, dear God, I want to bring back the Last Judgment for some of the good old sins of greed, pride, corruption, money grabbing, you name it. I would certainly put Satan back on his underworld throne or wherever he sits. But anyway, enough of that. Yeah, here comes everybody, said James Joyce. And, you know, again, as a convert, I love the fact that I'm in a church that is the whole human community, yes. That when we go for communion, we go, here comes everybody. We go as sinners, we go as everybody. You know, when we used to have communion services in the Presbyterian church in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and I used to be very aware of everyone who loves the Lord Jesus is welcome to the table. And I used to think, oh, I'm not sure I do today. It's like, you know, do you love your husband today? Well, that's a hard question, isn't it? But by and large, I do, and I'm here. And I do feel with the Catholic Church that I don't have again, it's about individualism, isn't it? No matter what my faith is today, I don't have to love Jesus today because, you know, I've signed up the way I've signed up to marriage. I'm here for the long term. But, you know, sometimes I'm not madly in love with it. It's life. And sometimes I go badly wrong. And so I think there is that communal, we carry each other. And, you know, back to gender and sex, how do we carry each other in our sometimes conflicting vulnerabilities? And priests are vulnerable, they're frightened. So many of them are lonely, so many of them would love to get married, so many of them would love to be openly gay, and so many of them desperately need help with their sexuality. But how do we say we're not here to hurt you, we're here to be with you, to just, you know, we're in this together forever.
I've heard it said that it's not well people that need a doctor, it's the sick people, and actually who is worthy to receive Holy Communion. So maybe, you know, we all need the blessing that brings, you know. Tina, you've really given us so much to mull over this evening. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Marion now. We'd like to perhaps say a prayer for you in a minute, if that's all right. Thank you so much.
Gosh, yeah, absolutely challenging. Paul says refreshing. I think that's an extremely good word for what we've heard this evening. So thank you so much, Tina. Pax Christi Scotland held an online event last night on International Women's Day, and that's the recordings now on our website, in which we discussed problems facing women in 2023. Your exploration of gender fluidity, women in the church, it just takes us so much further. Very challenging for us all. I'm sure that Anne mentioned that she felt that she was going to be doing some reading to follow up everything that you've raised. And I think that we all are in that situation now, that we have lots more to think about, lots more to do. So thank you so much. And yes, we would like to say a prayer. If I can have that on the screen, please. Loving God, we thank you for the insight, wisdom, and passion of Tina. We thank you for the way she has helped us to reflect in a synodal way on gender and the common good. We ask that you anoint her anew, such that her ministry may continue to be empowered by your Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. We would also pray for Pax Christi Scotland. Creator God, we thank you for Pax Christi Scotland. We ask that you empower them as they seek to promote a non-violent society through the home, the school, the parish, and wider society. We pray that we may join with them in promoting peace, respect of human rights, and justice and reconciliation throughout the world. Amen.
Amen.
And we conclude our evening by praying for ourselves as we go forth on our Lenten journey.
During this liturgical season, may we seek to ascend that high mountain in the company of Jesus. May we truly listen to him in Scripture and in the faces and the stories of our sisters and brothers, especially those who are in need. May the Spirit inspire us to rise and not be afraid as we face reality and its daily struggles, its hardships and contradictions. Amen.
Amen. Thanks everyone for joining us. We look forward to being with you next Thursday for the fourth evening of our Lenten journey with our friend and companion, Philippa Whitford, who will share with us politics and the common good. To those who are leaving at this point, good night, God bless, and we invite you to log off. For those who wish to stay on and join in a breakout room, please stay connected, and in a few minutes we will generate breakout rooms. Thanks again.